Hello, and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel you can hear my narrations, more than 100 to date, and more to come, of classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. To accompany the narrations, I've put a short profile of the authors in the video description, as well as some general background notes on the stories for those who'd like to know more. If you enjoy this content, please hit subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. The Matchmaker. The grill-room clock struck 11 with the respectful unobtrusiveness of one whose mission in life is to be ignored. When the flight of time should really have rendered abstinence and migration imperative, the lighting apparatus would signal the fact in the usual way. 6 minutes later, Clovis approached the supper table, in the blessed expectancy of one who has dined sketchily and long ago. "I'm starving," he announced, making an effort to sit down gracefully and read the menu at the same time. "So I gathered," said his host, "from the fact that you were nearly punctual. I ought to have told you that I'm a food reformer. I've ordered 2 bowls of bread and milk and some health biscuits. I hope you don't mind." Clovis pretended afterwards that he didn't go white above the collar line for the fraction of a second. "All the same," he said, "you ought not to joke about such things. There really are such people. I've known people who've met them. To think of all the adorable things there are to eat in the world, and then to go through life munching sawdust and being proud of it. They are like the flagellants of the Middle Ages, who went about mortifying themselves." "Well, they had some excuse," said Clovis. "They did it to save their immortal souls, didn't they? You needn't tell me that a man who doesn't love oysters and asparagus and good wines has got a soul, or a stomach either. He's simply got the instinct for being unhappy, highly developed." Clovis relapsed for a few golden moments into tender intimacies with a succession of rapidly disappearing oysters. "I think oysters are more beautiful than any religion," he resumed presently. "They not only forgive our unkindness to them, they justify it. They incite us to go on being perfectly horrid to them. Once they arrive at the supper table, they seem to enter thoroughly into the spirit of the thing. There's nothing in Christianity or Buddhism that quite matches the sympathetic unselfishness of an oyster. Do you like my new waistcoat? I'm wearing it for the first time tonight." "It looks like a great many others you've had lately, only worse. New dinner waistcoats are becoming a habit with you." "They say one always pays for the excesses of one's youth. Mercifully, that isn't true about one's clothes. My mother is thinking of getting married." "Again?" "It's the first time." "Oh, of course, you ought to know. I was under the impression that she'd been married once or twice at least." 3 times, to be mathematically exact. I meant that it was the first time she'd thought about getting married. The other times she did it without thinking. As a matter of fact, it's really I who am doing the thinking for her in this case. You see, it's quite 2 years since her last husband died." "You evidently think that brevity is the soul of widowhood." "Well, it struck me that she was getting moped and beginning to settle down, which wouldn't suit her a bit. The first symptom that I noticed was when she began to complain that we were living beyond our income. All decent people live beyond their incomes nowadays, and those who aren't respectable live beyond other people's. A few gifted individuals manage to do both. It's hardly so much a gift as an industry. The crisis came, returned Clovis, when she suddenly started the theory that late hours were bad for one, and wanted me to be in by 1 o'clock every night. Imagine that sort of thing for me, who was 18 on my last birthday. On your last 2 birthdays, to be mathematically exact. Oh, well, that's not my fault. I'm not going to arrive at 19 as long as my mother remains at 37. One must have some regard for appearances. Perhaps your mother would age a little in the process of settling down. That's the last thing she'd think of. Feminine reformations always start in on the failings of other people. That's why I was so keen on the husband idea. Did you go as far as to select the gentleman, or did you merely throw out a general idea and trust to the force of suggestion? If one wants a thing done in a hurry, one must see to it oneself. I found a military Johnny hanging round on a loose end at the club, and took him home to lunch once or twice. He'd spent most of his life on the Indian frontier, building roads and relieving famines and minimizing earthquakes, and all that sort of thing that one does do on frontiers. He could talk sense to a peevish cobra in 15 native languages, and probably knew what to do if you found a rogue elephant on your croquet lawn, but he was shy and diffident with women. I told my mother privately that he was an absolute woman-hater, so, of course, she laid herself out to flirt all she knew, which isn't a little. And was the gentleman responsive? I hear he told someone at the club that he was looking out for a colonial job, with plenty of hard work, for a young friend of his, so I gather that he has some idea of marrying into the family. You seem destined to be the victim of the Reformation, after all. Clovis wiped the trace of Turkish coffee, and the beginnings of a smile, from his lips, and slowly lowered his dexter eyelid, which, being interpreted, probably meant, "I don't think." The Stampeding of Lady Bastable. "It would be rather nice if you would put Clovis up for another 6 days while I go up north to the McGregors," said Mrs. Sangrail sleepily across the breakfast table. It was her invariable plan to speak in a sleepy, comfortable voice whenever she was unusually keen about anything. It put people off their guard, and they frequently fell in with her wishes before they had realized that she was really asking for anything. Lady Bastable, however, was not so easily taken unawares. Possibly she knew that voice, and what it betokened. At any rate, she knew Clovis. She frowned at a piece of toast, and ate it very slowly, as though she wished to convey the impression that the process hurt her more than it hurt the toast, but no extension of hospitality on Clovis's behalf rose to her lips. "It would be a great convenience to me," pursued Mrs. Sangrail, abandoning the careless tone. "I particularly don't want to take him to the McGregors, and it will only be for 6 days." "It will seem longer," said Lady Bastable dismally. "The last time he stayed here for a week—" "Oh, I know," interrupted the other hastily. "But that was nearly 2 years ago. He was younger then." "But he hasn't improved," said her hostess. "It's no use growing older if you only learn new ways of misbehaving yourself." Mrs. Sangrail was unable to argue the point. Since Clovis had reached the age of 17, she had never ceased to bewail his irrepressible waywardness to all her circle of acquaintances, and a polite scepticism would have greeted the slightest hint at a prospective reformation. She discarded the fruitless effort at cajolery and resorted to undisguised bribery. "If you'll have him here for these 6 days, I'll cancel that outstanding bridge account." It was only for 49 shillings, but Lady Bastable loved shillings with a great, strong love. To lose money at bridge and not to have to pay it was one of those rare experiences which gave the card-table a glamour in her eyes which it could never otherwise have possessed. Mrs. Sangrail was almost equally devoted to her card-winnings, but the prospect of conveniently warehousing her offspring for 6 days, and incidentally saving his railway fare to the north, reconciled her to the sacrifice. When Clovis made a belated appearance at the breakfast-table, the bargain had been struck. "Just think," said Mrs. Sangrail sleepily, "Lady Bastable has very kindly asked you to stay on here while I go to the McGregors." Clovis said suitable things in a highly unsuitable manner, and proceeded to make punitive expeditions among the breakfast dishes, with a scowl on his face that would have driven the purr out of a peace conference. The arrangement that had been concluded behind his back was doubly distasteful to him. In the first place, he particularly wanted to teach the McGregor boys, who could well afford the knowledge, how to play poker patience. Secondly, the Bastable catering was of the kind that is classified as a rude plenty, which Clovis translated as a plenty that gives rise to rude remarks. Watching him from behind ostentatiously sleepy lids, his mother realized, in the light of long experience, that any rejoicing over the success of her manoeuvre would be distinctly premature. It was one thing to fit Clovis into a convenient niche of the domestic jigsaw puzzle. It was quite another matter to get him to stay there. Lady Bastable was wont to retire in state to the morning-room immediately after breakfast, and spend a quiet hour in skimming through the papers. They were there, so she might as well get their money's worth out of them. Politics did not greatly interest her, but she was obsessed with a favourite foreboding that one of these days there would be a great social upheaval, in which everybody would be killed by everybody else. "It will come sooner than we think," she would observe darkly. A mathematical expert of exceptionally high powers would have been puzzled to work out the approximate date from the slender and confusing groundwork which this assertion afforded. On this particular morning, the sight of Lady Bastable enthroned among her papers gave Clovis the hint towards which his mind had been groping all breakfast-time. His mother had gone upstairs to supervise packing operations, and he was alone on the ground floor with his hostess and the servants. The latter were the key to the situation. Bursting wildly into the kitchen quarters, Clovis screamed a frantic, though strictly non-committal summons. "Poor Lady Bastable! In the morning-room! Oh, quick!" The next moment, the butler, cook, page-boy, 2 or 3 maids, and a gardener, who had happened to be in one of the outer kitchens, were following in a hot scurry after Clovis as he headed back for the morning-room. Lady Bastable was roused from the world of newspaper lore by hearing a Japanese screen in the hall go down with a crash. Then the door leading from the hall flew open, and her young guest tore madly through the room, shrieked at her in passing, "The Jacquerie! They're on us!" and dashed like an escaping hawk out through the French window. The scared mob of servants burst in on his heels, the gardener still clutching the sickle with which he had been trimming hedges, and the impetus of their headlong haste carried them, slipping and sliding, over the smooth parquet flooring, towards the chair where their mistress sat in panic-stricken amazement. If she had had a moment granted her for reflection, she would have behaved, as she afterwards explained, with considerable dignity. It was probably the sickle which decided her, but anyway she followed the lead that Clovis had given her through the French window, and ran well and far across the lawn before the eyes of her astonished retainers. Lost dignity is not a possession which can be restored at a moment's notice. and both Lady Bastable and the butler found the process of returning to normal conditions almost as painful as a slow recovery from drowning. A Jacquerie, even if carried out with the most respectful of intentions, cannot fail to leave some traces of embarrassment behind it. By lunchtime, however, decorum had reasserted itself with enhanced rigour, as a natural rebound from its recent overthrow, and the meal was served in a frigid stateliness that might have been framed on a Byzantine model. Halfway through its duration, Mrs. Sangrail was solemnly presented with an envelope lying on a silver salver. It contained a cheque for 49 shillings. The McGregor boys learned how to play poker patience. After all, they could afford to. The Talking-Out of Tarrington. "Heavens!" exclaimed the aunt of Clovis. "Here's someone I know bearing down on us. I can't remember his name, but he lunched with us once in town. Tarrington, yes, that's it. He's heard of the picnic I'm giving for the princess, and he'll cling to me like a lifebelt till I give him an invitation. Then he'll ask if he may bring all his wives and mothers and sisters with him. That's the worst of these small watering places. One can't escape from anybody." "I'll fight a rearguard action for you, if you like to do a bolt now," volunteered Clovis. "You've a clear 10 yards start, if you don't lose time." The aunt of Clovis responded gamely to the suggestion, and churned away like a Nile steamer, with a long brown ripple of Pekingese spaniel trailing in her wake. "Pretend you don't know him," was her parting advice, tinged with the reckless courage of the non-combatant. The next moment, the overtures of an affably disposed gentleman were being received by Clovis with a silent upon a Pekingarian stare, which denoted an absence of all previous acquaintance with the object scrutinized. "I expect you don't know me with my moustache," said the newcomer. "I've only grown it during the last 2 months." "On the contrary," said Clovis, "the moustache is the only thing about you that seemed familiar to me. I felt certain that I had met it somewhere before." "My name is Tarrington," resumed the candidate for recognition. "A very useful kind of name," said Clovis. "With a name of that sort, no one would blame you if you did nothing in particular heroic or remarkable, would they? And yet, if you were to raise a troop of light horse in a moment of national emergency, Tarrington's light horse would sound quite appropriate and pulse-quickening, whereas, if you were called Spoopin, for instance, the thing would be out of the question. No one, even in a moment of national emergency, could possibly belong to Spoopin's horse." The newcomer smiled weakly, as one who is not to be put off by mere flippancy, and began again with patient persistence. "I think you ought to remember my name." "I shall," said Clovis, with an air of immense sincerity. "My aunt was asking me only this morning to suggest names for 4 young owls she's just had sent her as pets. I shall call them all Tarrington. Then, if 1 or 2 of them die, or fly away, or leave us in any of the ways that pet owls are prone to, there will always be 1 or 2 left to carry on your name, and my aunt won't let me forget it. She will always be asking, 'Have the Tarringtons had their mice?' and questions of that sort. She says if you keep wild creatures in captivity, you ought to see after their wants, and, of course, she's quite right there." "I met you at luncheon at your aunt's house once," broke in Mr. Tarrington, pale but still resolute. "My aunt never lunches," said Clovis. "She belongs to the National Anti-Luncheon League, which is doing quite a lot of good work in a quiet, unobtrusive way. A subscription of ½ a crown per quarter entitles you to go without 92 luncheons." This must be something new," exclaimed Tarrington. "It's the same aunt that I've always had," said Clovis coldly. "I perfectly well remember meeting you at a luncheon party given by your aunt," persisted Tarrington, who was beginning to flush an unhealthy shade of mottled pink. "What was there for lunch?" asked Clovis. "Oh, well, I don't remember that." "How nice of you to remember my aunt, when you can no longer recall the names of the things you ate. Now, my memory works quite differently. I can remember a menu long after I've forgotten the hostess that accompanied it. When I was 7 years old, I recollect being given a peach at a garden party by some duchess or other. I can't remember a thing about her, except that I imagine our acquaintance must have been of the slightest, as she called me a nice little boy. But I have unfading memories of that peach. It was one of those exuberant peaches that meet you halfway, so to speak, and are all over you in a moment. It was a beautiful, unspoiled product of a hothouse, and yet it managed quite successfully to give itself the airs of a compote. You had to bite it and imbibe it at the same time. To me, there has always been something charming and mystic in the thought of that delicate velvet globe of fruit, slowly ripening and warming to perfection through the long summer days and perfumed nights, and then coming suddenly athwart my life in the supreme moment of its existence. I can never forget it, even if I wished to. And when I had devoured all that was edible of it, there still remained the stone, which a heedless, thoughtless child would doubtless have thrown away. I put it down the neck of a young friend who was wearing a very décolleté sailor suit. I told him it was a scorpion, and from the way he wriggled and screamed, he evidently believed it, though where the silly kid imagined I could procure a live scorpion at a garden party, I don't know. Altogether, that peach is, for me, an unfading and happy memory." The defeated Tarrington had, by this time, retreated out of earshot, comforting himself as best he might, with the reflection that a picnic which included the presence of Clovis might prove a doubtfully agreeable experience. "I shall certainly go in for a parliamentary career," said Clovis to himself, as he turned complacently to rejoin his aunt. "As a talker out of inconvenient bills, I should be invaluable." The Recessional. Clovis sat in the hottest zone but two of a Turkish bath, alternately inert in statuesque contemplation and rapidly manoeuvring a fountain pen over the pages of a notebook. "Don't interrupt me with your childish prattle," he observed to Bertie Van Tahn, who had slung himself languidly into a neighbouring chair and looked conversationally inclined. "I'm writing deathless verse." Bertie looked interested. "I say, what a boon you would be to portrait painters if you really got to be notorious as a poetry writer. If they couldn't get your likeness hung in the Academy as Clovis Sangrail, Esquire, at work on his latest poem, they could slip you in as a study of the nude, or Orpheus descending into Jermyn Street. They always complain that modern dress handicaps them, whereas a towel and a fountain pen—" "It was Mrs. Packletide's suggestion that I should write this thing," said Clovis, ignoring the bypaths to fame that Bertie Van Tahn was pointing out to him. "You see, Luna Bimberton had a coronation ode accepted by the New Infancy, a paper that has been started with the idea of making the New Age seem elderly and hidebound." "So clever of you, dear Luna," the Packletide remarked when she had read it. "Of course, anyone could write a coronation ode, but no one else would have thought of doing it." Luna protested that these things were extremely difficult to do, and gave us to understand that they were more or less the province of a gifted few. Now, the Packletide has been rather decent to me in many ways, a sort of financial ambulance, you know, that carries you off the field when you're hard hit, which is a frequent occurrence with me, and I've no use whatever for Luna Bimberton. So I chipped in and said I could turn out that sort of stuff by the square yard if I gave my mind to it. Luna said I couldn't, and we got bets on, and between you and me, I think the money's fairly safe. Of course, one of the conditions of the wager is that the thing has to be published in something or other, local newspapers barred. But Mrs. Packletide has endeared herself by many little acts of thoughtfulness to the editor of the Smoky Chimney, so if I can hammer out anything at all approaching the level of the usual ode output, we ought to be all right. So far I'm getting along so comfortably that I begin to be afraid that I must be one of the gifted few. "It's rather late in the day for a coronation ode, isn't it?" said Bertie. "Of course," said Clovis. "This is going to be a Durbar recessional, the sort of thing that you can keep by you for all time, if you want to." "Now I understand your choice of a place to write it in," said Bertie Van Tahn, with the air of one who has suddenly unravelled a hitherto obscure problem. "You want to get the local temperature." "I came here to get freedom from the inane interruptions of the mentally deficient," said Clovis, "but it seems I asked too much of fate." Bertie Van Tahn prepared to use his towel as a weapon of precision, but reflecting that he had a good deal of unprotected coastline himself, and that Clovis was equipped with a fountain pen as well as a towel, he relapsed pacifically into the depths of his chair. "May one hear extracts from the immortal work?" he asked. "I promise that nothing that I hear now shall prejudice me against borrowing a copy of the Smoky Chimney at the right moment." "It's rather like casting pearls into a trough," remarked Clovis pleasantly, "but I don't mind reading you bits of it. It begins with a general dispersal of the Durbar participants. Back to their homes in Himalayan heights, the stale, pale elephants of Cooch Behar roll like great galleons on a tideless sea. "I don't believe Cooch Behar is anywhere near the Himalayan region," interrupted Bertie. "You ought to have an atlas on hand when you do this sort of thing. And why stale and pale?" "After the late hours and the excitement, of course," said Clovis. "And I said their homes were in the Himalayas. You can have Himalayan elephants in Cooch Behar, I suppose, just as you have Irish-bred horses running at Ascot." "You said they were going back to the Himalayas," objected Bertie. "Well, they would naturally be sent home to recuperate. It's the usual thing out there to turn elephants loose in the hills, just as we put horses out to grass in this country." Clovis could at least flatter himself that he had infused some of the reckless splendour of the East into his mendacity. "Is it all going to be in blank verse?" asked the critic. "Of course not. Durbar comes at the end of the fourth line." "That seems so cowardly. However, it explains why you pitched on Cooch Behar." "There is more connection between geographical place names and poetical inspiration than is generally recognised. One of the chief reasons why there are so few really great poems about Russia in our language is that you can't possibly get a rhyme to names like Smolensk and Tobolsk and Minsk." Clovis spoke with the authority of one who has tried. "Of course you could rhyme Omsk with Tomsk," he continued. "In fact, they seem to be there for that purpose, but the public wouldn't stand that sort of thing indefinitely." "The public will stand a good deal," said Bertie malevolently. "And so small a proportion of it knows Russian that you could always have an explanatory footnote asserting that the last three letters in Smolensk are not pronounced. It's quite as believable as your statement about putting elephants out to grass in the Himalayan range." "I've got rather a nice bit," resumed Clovis with unruffled serenity, "giving an evening scene on the outskirts of a jungle village, where the coiled cobra in the gloaming gloats, and prowling panthers stalk the wary goats." "There is practically no gloaming in tropical countries," said Bertie indulgently, "but I like the masterly reticence with which you treat the cobra's motive for gloating. The unknown is proverbially the uncanny. I can picture nervous readers of the smoky chimney keeping the light turned on in their bedrooms all night, out of sheer sickening uncertainty as to what the cobra might have been gloating about. "Cobras gloat naturally," said Clovis, "just as wolves are always ravening from mere force of habit, even after they've hopelessly overeaten themselves. I've got a fine bit of colour painting later on," he added, "where I describe the dawn coming up over the Brahmaputra river. The amber dawn-drenched east, with sun-shafts kissed, stained sanguine apricot and amethyst, o'er the washed emerald of the mango groves, hangs in a mist of opalescent mauves, while painted parrot flights impinge the haze with scarlet, chalcedon, and chrysoprase." "I've never seen the dawn come up over the Brahmaputra river," said Bertie, "so I can't say if it's a good description of the event, but it sounds more like an account of an extensive jewel robbery. Anyhow, the parrots give a good useful touch of local colour. I suppose you've introduced some tigers into the scenery. An Indian landscape would have rather a bare, unfinished look without a tiger or two in the middle distance." "I've got a hen tiger somewhere in the poem," said Clovis, hunting through his notes. "Here she is. The tawny tigress, mid the tangled teak, drags to her purring cubs' enraptured ears the harsh death-rattle in the pea-fowl's beak, a jungle lullaby of blood and tears." Bertie Van Tahn rose hurriedly from his recumbent position and made for the glass door leading into the next compartment. "I think your idea of home life in the jungle is perfectly horrid," he said. "The cobra was sinister enough, but the improvised rattle in the tiger nursery is the limit. If you're going to make me turn hot and cold all over, I may as well go into the steam room at once." "Just listen to this line," said Clovis. "It would make the reputation of any ordinary poet. And overhead, the pendulum-patient punkah, parent of still-born breeze." Most of your readers will think punkah is a kind of iced drink, or half-time at polo, said Bertie, and disappeared into the steam. The Smoky Chimney duly published the Recessional, but it proved to be its swan song, for the paper never attained to another issue. Luna Bimberton gave up her intention of attending the Durbar, and went into a nursing home on the Sussex Downs. Nervous breakdown, after a particularly strenuous season, was the usually accepted explanation, but there are 3 or 4 people who know that she never really recovered from the dawn breaking over the Brahmaputra river. The Secret Sin of Septimus Brope. "Who and what is Mr. Brope?" demanded the aunt of Clovis, suddenly. Mrs. Riversedge, who had been snipping off the heads of defunct roses, and thinking of nothing in particular, sprang hurriedly to mental attention. She was one of those old-fashioned hostesses who consider that one ought to know something about one's guests, and that the something ought to be to their credit. "I believe he comes from Leighton Buzzard," she observed, by way of preliminary explanation. "In these days of rapid and convenient travel," said Clovis, who was dispersing a colony of greenfly with visitations of cigarette smoke, "to come from Leighton Buzzard does not necessarily denote any great strength of character. It might only mean mere restlessness. Now, if he had left it under a cloud, or as a protest against the incurable and heartless frivolity of its inhabitants, that would tell us something about the man and his mission in life." "What does he do?" pursued Mrs. Troyle, magisterially. "He edits the Cathedral Monthly," said her hostess, "and he's enormously learned about memorial brasses and transepts, and the influence of Byzantine worship on modern liturgy, and all those sorts of things. Perhaps he is just a little bit heavy and immersed in one range of subjects, but it takes all sorts to make a good house party, you know. You don't find him too dull, do you?" "Dullness I could overlook," said the aunt of Clovis. "What I cannot forgive is his making love to my maid." "My dear Mrs. Troyle," gasped the hostess, "what an extraordinary idea! I assure you, Mr. Brope would not dream of doing such a thing." "His dreams are a matter of indifference to me. For all I care, his slumbers may be one long indiscretion of unsuitable erotic advances, in which the entire servants' hall may be involved. But in his waking hours he shall not make love to my maid. It's no use arguing about it. I'm firm on the point." "But you must be mistaken," persisted Mrs. Riversedge. "Mr. Brope would be the last person to do such a thing." "He is the first person to do such a thing, as far as my information goes, and if I have any voice in the matter, he certainly shall be the last. Of course, I am not referring to respectably intentioned lovers." "Well, I simply cannot think that a man who writes so charmingly and informingly about transepts and Byzantine influences would behave in such an unprincipled manner," said Mrs. Riversedge. "What evidence have you that he's doing anything of the sort? I don't want to doubt your word, of course, but we mustn't be too ready to condemn him unheard, must we?" "Whether we condemn him or not, he has certainly not been unheard. He has the room next to my dressing-room, and on 2 occasions, when I dare say he thought I was absent, I have plainly heard him announcing through the wall, 'I love you, Florrie.' Those partition walls upstairs are very thin. One could almost hear a watch ticking in the next room." "Is your maid called Florence?" "Her name is Florinda." "Oh, what an extraordinary name to give a maid." "I did not give it to her. She arrived in my service already christened." "What I mean is," said Mrs. Riversedge, "that when I get maids with unsuitable names, I call them Jane. They soon get used to it." "An excellent plan," said the aunt of Clovis, coldly. "Unfortunately, I have got used to being called Jane myself. It happens to be my name." She cut short Mrs. Riversedge's flood of apologies by abruptly remarking, "The question is not whether I'm to call my maid Florinda, but whether Mr. Brope is to be permitted to call her Florrie. I am strongly of opinion that he shall not." "He may have been repeating the words of some song," said Mrs. Riversedge hopefully. "There are lots of those sorts of silly refrains with girls' names," she continued, turning to Clovis as a possible authority on the subject. "You mustn't call me Mary." "I shouldn't think of doing so," Clovis assured her. "In the first place, I've always understood that your name was Henrietta, and then I hardly know you well enough to take such a liberty." "I mean, there's a song with that refrain," hurriedly explained Mrs. Riversedge. "And there's Rhoda, Rhoda, kept a pagoda, and Maisie is a daisy, and heaps of others. Certainly it doesn't sound like Mr. Brope to be singing such songs, but I think we ought to give him the benefit of the doubt." "I had already done so," said Mrs. Troyle, "until further evidence came my way." She shut her lips with the resolute finality of one who enjoys the blessed certainty of being implored to open them again. "Further evidence?" exclaimed her hostess. "Do tell me." "As I was coming upstairs after breakfast, Mr. Brope was just passing my room. In the most natural way in the world, a piece of paper dropped out of a packet that he held in his hand, and fluttered to the ground just at my door. I was going to call out to him, 'You've dropped something,' and then for some reason I held back and didn't show myself till he was safely in his room. You see, it occurred to me that I was very seldom in my room just at that hour, and that Florinda was almost always there, tidying up things about that time. So I picked up that innocent-looking piece of paper." Mrs. Troyle paused again, with the self-applauding air of one who has detected an asp lurking in an apple charlotte. Mrs. Riversedge snipped vigorously at the nearest rose bush, incidentally decapitating a Viscountess Folkestone that was just coming into bloom. "What was on the paper?" she asked. "Just the words, in pencil, 'I love you, Florrie,' and then, underneath, crossed out with a faint line, but perfectly plain to read, 'Meet me in the garden by the yew.'" "There is a yew tree at the bottom of the garden," admitted Mrs. Riversedge. "At any rate, he appears to be truthful," commented Clovis. "To think that a scandal of this sort should be going on under my roof," said Mrs. Riversedge indignantly. "I wonder why it is that scandal seems so much worse under a roof," observed Clovis. "I've always regarded it as a proof of the superior delicacy of the cat tribe, that it conducts most of its scandals above the slates." "Now I come to think of it," resumed Mrs. Riversedge, "there are things about Mr. Brope that I've never been able to account for. His income, for instance. He only gets 200 a year as editor of the Cathedral Monthly, and I know that his people are quite poor, and he hasn't any private means. Yet he manages to afford a flat somewhere in Westminster, and he goes abroad to Bruges and those sorts of places every year, and always dresses well, and gives quite nice luncheon parties in the season. You can't do all that on 200 a year, can you?" "Does he write for any other papers?" queried Mrs. Troyle. "No. You see, he specialises so entirely on liturgy and ecclesiastical architecture that his field is rather restricted. He once tried the Sporting and Dramatic, with an article on church edifices in famous fox-hunting centres, but it wasn't considered of sufficient general interest to be accepted. No, I don't see how he can support himself in his present style merely by what he writes." "Perhaps he sells spurious transepts to American enthusiasts," suggested Clovis. "How could you sell a transept?" said Mrs. Riversedge. "Such a thing would be impossible." "Whatever he may do to eke out his income," interrupted Mrs. Troyle, "he is certainly not going to fill his leisure moments by making love to my maid." "Of course not," agreed her hostess. "That must be put a stop to at once. But I don't quite know what we ought to do." "You might put a barbed wire entanglement round the yew tree as a precautionary measure," said Clovis. "I don't think that the disagreeable situation that has arisen is improved by flippancy," said Mrs. Riversedge. "A good maid is a treasure." "I am sure I don't know what I should do without Florinda," admitted Mrs. Troyle. "She understands my hair. I've long ago given up trying to do anything with it myself. I regard one's hair as I regard husbands. As long as one is seen together in public, one's private divergences don't matter. Surely that was the luncheon gong." Septimus Brope and Clovis had the smoking-room to themselves after lunch. The former seemed restless and preoccupied, the latter quietly observant. "What is a lorry?" asked Septimus suddenly. "I don't mean the thing on wheels, of course I know what that is, but isn't there a bird with a name like that, the larger form of a lorikeet?" "I fancy it's a lory with one R," said Clovis lazily. "In which case it's no good to you." Septimus Brope stared in some astonishment. How do you mean, no good to me?" he asked, with more than a trace of uneasiness in his voice. "Won't rhyme with Florrie," explained Clovis briefly. Septimus sat upright in his chair, with unmistakable alarm on his face. "How did you find out? I mean, how did you know I was trying to get a rhyme to Florrie?" he asked sharply. "I didn't know," said Clovis. "I only guessed. When you wanted to turn the prosaic lorry of commerce into a feathered poem flitting through the verdure of a tropical forest, I knew you must be working up a sonnet, and Florrie was the only female name that suggested itself as rhyming with lorry. Septimus still looked uneasy. "I believe you know more," he said. Clovis laughed quietly, but said nothing. "How much do you know?" Septimus asked desperately. "The yew tree in the garden," said Clovis. "There, I felt certain I'd dropped it somewhere. But you must have guessed something before. Look here, you have surprised my secret. You won't give me away, will you? It is nothing to be ashamed of, but it wouldn't do for the editor of the Cathedral Monthly to go in openly for that sort of thing, would it?" "Well, I suppose not," admitted Clovis. "You see," continued Septimus, "I get quite a decent lot of money out of it. I could never live in the style I do on what I get as editor of the Cathedral Monthly." Clovis was even more startled than Septimus had been earlier in the conversation, but he was better skilled in repressing surprise. "Do you mean to say you get money out of Florrie?" he asked. "Not out of Florrie, as yet," said Septimus. "In fact, I don't mind saying that I'm having a good deal of trouble over Florrie, but there are a lot of others." Clovis's cigarette went out. "This is very interesting," he said slowly, and then, with Septimus Brope's next words, illumination dawned on him. "There are heaps of others. For instance, Cora with the lips of coral, you and I will never quarrel. That was one of my earliest successes, and it still brings me in royalties. And then there is Esmeralda, when I first beheld her, and Fair Teresa, how I love to please her. Both of those have been fairly popular. And there is one rather dreadful one," continued Septimus, flushing deep carmine, "which has brought me in more money than any of the others. Lively little Lucy, with her naughty ne retrousse. Of course, I loathe the whole lot of them. In fact, I'm rapidly becoming something of a woman-hater under their influence, but I can't afford to disregard the financial aspect of the matter. And at the same time, you can understand that my position as an authority on ecclesiastical architecture and liturgical subjects would be weakened, if not altogether ruined, if it once got about that I was the author of Cora with the lips of coral, and all the rest of them." Clovis had recovered sufficiently to ask in a sympathetic, if rather unsteady voice, what was the special trouble with Florrie. "I can't get her into lyric shape, try as I will," said Septimus mournfully. "You see, one has to work in a lot of sentimental, sugary compliment with a catchy rhyme, and a certain amount of personal biography or prophecy. They've all of them got to have a long string of past successes recorded about them, or else you've got to foretell blissful things about them and yourself in the future. For instance, there is dainty little girly Mavis, she is such a rarer avis, all the money I can save is, all to be for Mavis mine. It goes to a sickening namby-pamby waltz tune, and for months nothing else was sung and hummed in Blackpool and other popular centres." This time Clovis's self-control broke down badly. "Please excuse me," he gurgled, "but I can't help it when I remember the awful solemnity of that article of yours that you so kindly read us last night on the Coptic Church in its relation to early Christian worship." Septimus groaned. "Oh, you see how it would be," he said. "As soon as people knew me to be the author of that miserable sentimental twaddle, all respect for the serious labours of my life would be gone. I dare say I know more about memorial brasses than any one living. In fact, I hope one day to publish a monograph on the subject, but I should be pointed out everywhere as the man whose ditties were in the mouths of seaside minstrels along the entire coastline of our island home. Can you wonder that I positively hate Florrie all the time that I'm trying to grind out sugar-coated rhapsodies about her? Well, why not give free play to your emotions, and be brutally abusive. An uncomplimentary refrain would have an instant success as a novelty, if you were sufficiently outspoken." "I've never thought of that," said Septimus, "and I'm afraid I couldn't break away from the habit of fulsome adulation and suddenly change my style." "You needn't change your style in the least," said Clovis. "Merely reverse the sentiment, and keep to the inane phraseology of the thing. If you'll do the body of the song, I'll knock off the refrain, which is the thing that principally matters, I believe. I shall charge half shares in the royalties, and throw in my silence as to your guilty secret. In the eyes of the world, you shall still be the man who has devoted his life to the study of transepts and Byzantine ritual. Only sometimes, in the long winter evenings, when the wind howls drearily down the chimney and the rain beats against the windows, I shall think of you as the author of Cora with the Lips of Coral. Of course, if, in sheer gratitude at my silence, you like to take me for a much-needed holiday to the Adriatic, or somewhere equally interesting, paying all expenses, I shouldn't dream of refusing." Later in the afternoon, Clovis found his aunt and Mrs. Riversedge indulging in gentle exercise in the Jacobean garden. "I've spoken to Mr. Brope about F," he announced. "How splendid of you! What did he say?" came in a quick chorus from the two ladies. "He was quite frank and straightforward with me when he saw that I knew his secret," said Clovis, "and it seems that his intentions were quite serious, if slightly unsuitable. I tried to show him the impracticability of the course that he was following. He said he wanted to be understood, and he seemed to think that Florinda would excel in that requirement. But I pointed out that there were probably dozens of delicately nurtured, pure-hearted young English girls who would be capable of understanding him, while Florinda was the only person in the world who understood my aunt's hair. That rather weighed with him, for he's not really a selfish animal, if you take him in the right way, and when I appealed to the memory of his happy childish days, spent amid the daisied fields of Leighton Buzzard — I suppose daisies do grow there — he was obviously affected. Anyhow, he gave me his word that he would put Florinda absolutely out of his mind, and he has agreed to go for a short trip abroad, as the best distraction for his thoughts. I am going with him as far as Ragusa. If my aunt should wish to give me a really nice scarf-pin, to be chosen by myself, as a small recognition of the very considerable service I had done her, I shouldn't dream of refusing. I'm not one of those who think that because one is abroad one can go about dressed anyhow." A few weeks later, in Blackpool and places where they sing, the following refrain held undisputed sway. "How you bore me, Florrie, with those eyes of vacant blue. You'll be very sorry, Florrie, if I marry you. Though I'm easy-going, Florrie, this I swear is true. I'll throw you down a quarry, Florrie, if I marry you." The way to the dairy. The Baroness and Clovis sat in a much-frequented corner of the park, exchanging biographical confidences about the long succession of passers-by. "Who are those depressed-looking young women who have just gone by?" asked the Baroness. "They have the air of people who have bowed to destiny and are not quite sure whether the salute will be returned." "Those," said Clovis, "are the Brimley Bomefields. I dare say you would look depressed if you had been through their experiences." "I'm always having depressing experiences," said the Baroness, "but I never give them outward expression. It's as bad as looking one's age. Tell me about the Brimley Bomefields." "Well," said Clovis, "the beginning of their tragedy was that they found an aunt. The aunt had been there all the time, but they had very nearly forgotten her existence until a distant relative refreshed their memory by remembering her very distinctly in his will. It is wonderful what the force of example will accomplish. The aunt, who had been unobtrusively poor, became quite pleasantly rich, and the Brimley Bomefields grew suddenly concerned at the loneliness of her life, and took her under their collective wings. She had as many wings around her at this time as one of those beast things in Revelation. "So far, I don't see any tragedy from the Brimley Bomefields' point of view," said the Baroness. "We haven't got to it yet," said Clovis. "The aunt had been used to living very simply, and had seen next to nothing of what we should consider life, and her nieces didn't encourage her to do much in the way of making a splash with her money. Quite a good deal of it would come to them at her death, and she was a fairly old woman. But there was one circumstance which cast a shadow of gloom over the satisfaction they felt in the discovery and acquisition of this desirable aunt. She openly acknowledged that a comfortable slice of her little fortune would go to a nephew on the other side of her family. He was rather a deplorable thing in rotters, and quite hopelessly top-hole in the way of getting through money. But he had been more or less decent to the old lady in her unremembered days, and she wouldn't hear anything against him. At least, she wouldn't pay any attention to what she did hear, but her nieces took care that she should have to listen to a good deal in that line. It seemed such a pity, they said among themselves, that good money should fall into such worthless hands. They habitually spoke of their aunt's money as good money, as though other people's aunts dabbled for the most part in spurious currency. Regularly, after the Derby, St. Leger, and other notable racing events, they indulged in audible speculations as to how much money Roger had squandered in unfortunate betting transactions. "His travelling expenses must come to a big sum," said the eldest Brimley Bomefield one day. "They say he attends every race meeting in England, besides others abroad. I shouldn't wonder if he went all the way to India to see the race for the Calcutta sweepstake that one hears so much about." "Travel enlarges the mind, my dear Christine," said her aunt. "Yes, dear aunt, travel undertaken in the right spirit," agreed Christine. "But travel pursued merely as a means towards gambling and extravagant living is more likely to contract the purse than to enlarge the mind. However, as long as Roger enjoys himself, I suppose he doesn't care how fast or unprofitably the money goes, or where he is to find more. It seems a pity, that's all." The aunt by that time had begun to talk of something else, and it was doubtful if Christine's moralizing had been even accorded a hearing. It was her remark, however, the aunt's remark, I mean, about travel enlarging the mind, that gave the youngest Brimley Bomefield her great idea for the showing up of Roger. "If aunt could only be taken somewhere to see him gambling and throwing away money," she said, "it would open her eyes to his character more effectually than anything we can say." "My dear Veronique," said her sisters, "we can't go following him to race meetings." "Certainly not to race meetings," said Veronique, "but we might go to some place where one can look on at gambling without taking part in it." "Do you mean Monte Carlo?" they asked her, beginning to jump rather at the idea. "Monte Carlo is a long way off, and has a dreadful reputation," said Veronique. "I shouldn't like to tell our friends that we were going to Monte Carlo, but I believe Roger usually goes to Dieppe about this time of year, and some quite respectable English people go there, and the journey wouldn't be expensive. If aunt could stand at the Channel crossing, the change of scene might do her a lot of good." And that was how the fateful idea came to the Brimley Bomefields. From the very first set-off, disaster hung over the expedition, as they afterwards remembered. To begin with, all the Brimley Bomefields were extremely unwell during the crossing. while the aunt enjoyed the sea air and made friends with all manner of strange travelling companions. Then, although it was many years since she had been on the continent, she had served a very practical apprenticeship there as a paid companion, and her knowledge of colloquial French beat theirs to a standstill. It became increasingly difficult to keep under their collective wings a person who knew what she wanted and was able to ask for it, and to see that she got it. Also, as far as Roger was concerned, they drew Dieppe blank. It turned out that he was staying at Pourville, a little watering place a mile or two further west. The Brimley Bomefields discovered that Dieppe was too crowded and frivolous, and persuaded the old lady to migrate to the comparative seclusion of Pourville. "You won't find it dull, you know," they assured her. "There is a little casino attached to the hotel, and you can watch the people dancing and throwing away their money at petits chevaux." It was just before petits chevaux had been supplanted by boules. Roger was not staying in the same hotel, but they knew that the casino would be certain of his patronage on most afternoons and evenings. On the first evening of their visit, they wandered into the casino after a fairly early dinner, and hovered near the tables. Bertie Van Tarn was staying there at the time, and he described the whole incident to me. The Brimley Bomefields kept a furtive watch on the doors, as though they were expecting someone to turn up, and the aunt got more and more amused and interested, watching the little horses whirl round and round the board. "Do you know, poor little number 8 hasn't won for the last 32 times," she said to Christine. "I've been keeping count. I shall really have to put 5 francs on him to encourage him." "Come and watch the dancing, dear," said Christine nervously. It was scarcely a part of their strategy that Roger should come in and find the old lady backing her fancy at the petits chevaux table. "Just wait while I put 5 francs on number 8, said the aunt, and in another moment her money was lying on the table. The horses commenced to move round. It was a slow race this time, and number 8 crept up at the finish like some crafty demon, and placed his nose just a fraction in front of number 3, who had seemed to be winning easily. Recourse had to be had to measurement, and the number 8 was proclaimed the winner. The aunt picked up 35 francs. After that, the Brimley Bomefields would have had to have used concerted force to get her away from the tables. When Roger appeared on the scene, she was 52 francs to the good. Her nieces were hovering forlornly in the background, like chickens that have been hatched out by a duck, and are despairingly watching their parent disporting herself in a dangerous and uncongenial element. The supper party which Roger insisted on standing that night in honour of his aunt and the 3 Miss Brimley Bomefields was remarkable for the unrestrained gaiety of 2 of the participants, and the funereal mirthlessness of the remaining guests. "I do not think," Christine confided afterwards to a friend, who reconfided it to Bertie Van Tarn, "that I shall ever be able to touch pâté de foie gras again. It would bring back memories of that awful evening." For the next 2 or 3 days, the nieces made plans for returning to England, or moving on to some other resort where there was no casino. The aunt was busy making a system for winning at petits chevaux. Number 8, her first love, had been running rather unkindly for her, and a series of plunges on number 5 had turned out even worse. "Do you know, I dropped over 700 francs at the tables this afternoon," she announced cheerfully at dinner on the 4th evening of their visit. "Aunt, 28 pounds, and you were losing last night too." "Oh, I shall get it all back," she said optimistically, "but not here. These silly little horses are no good. I shall go somewhere where one can play comfortably at roulette. You needn't look so shocked. I've always felt that, given the opportunity, I should be an inveterate gambler, and now you darlings have put the opportunity in my way. I must drink your very good healths. Waiter, a bottle of the Pontet Canet. Ah, it's number 7 on the wine list. I shall plunge on number 7 tonight. It won 4 times running this afternoon when I was backing that silly number 5. Number 7 was not in a winning mood that evening. The Brimley Bomefields, tired of watching disaster from a distance, drew near to the table where their aunt was now an honoured habituée, and gazed mournfully at the successive victories of 1 and 5, and 8 and 4, which swept good money out of the purse of 7's obstinate backer. The day's losses totalled something very near 2,000 francs. "You incorrigible gamblers," said Roger chaffingly to them, when he found them at the tables. "We are not gambling," said Christine freezingly. "We are looking on." "I don't think," said Roger knowingly. "Of course you're a syndicate, and Aunt is putting the stakes on for all of you. Anyone can tell by your looks when the wrong horse wins that you've got a stake on." Aunt and nephew had a supper alone that night, or at least they would have if Bertie hadn't joined them. All the Brimley Bomefields had headaches. The aunt carried them all off to Dieppe the next day, and set cheerily about the task of winning back some of her losses. Her luck was variable. In fact, she had some fair streaks of good fortune, just enough to keep her thoroughly amused with her new distraction, but on the whole she was a loser. The Brimley Bomefields had a collective attack of nervous prostration on the day when she sold out a quantity of shares in Argentine rails. "Nothing will ever bring that money back," they remarked lugubriously to one another. Veronique at last could bear it no longer, and went home. You see, it had been her idea to bring the aunt on this disastrous expedition, and though the others did not cast the fact verbally in her face, there was a certain lurking reproach in their eyes, which was harder to meet than actual upbraidings. The other 2 remained behind, forlornly mounting guard over their aunt, until such time as the waning of the Dieppe season should at last turn her in the direction of home and safety. They made anxious calculations as to how little good money might, with reasonable luck, be squandered in the meantime. Here, however, their reckoning went far astray. The close of the Dieppe season merely turned their aunt's thoughts in search of some other convenient gambling resort. Show a cat the way to the dairy. I forget how the proverb goes on, but it summed up the situation as far as the Brimley Bomefields' aunt was concerned. She had been introduced to unexplored pleasures, and found them greatly to her liking, and she was in no hurry to forego the fruits of her newly acquired knowledge. You see, for the first time in her life, the old thing was thoroughly enjoying herself. She was losing money, but she had plenty of fun and excitement over the process, and she had enough left to do very comfortably on. Indeed, she was only just learning to understand the art of doing oneself well. She was a popular hostess, and in return her fellow gamblers were always ready to entertain her to dinners and suppers when their luck was in. Her nieces, who still remained in attendance on her, with the pathetic unwillingness of a crew to leave a foundering treasure ship which might yet be steered into port, found little pleasure in these bohemian festivities. To see good money lavished on good living, for the entertainment of a nondescript circle of acquaintances, who were not likely to be in any way socially useful to them, did not attune them to a spirit of revelry. They contrived, whenever possible, to excuse themselves from participation in their aunt's deplored gaieties. The Brimley Bomefield headaches became famous. And one day the nieces came to the conclusion that, as they would have expressed it, no useful purpose would be served by their continued attendance on a relative who had so thoroughly emancipated herself from the sheltering protection of their wings. The aunt bore the announcement of their departure with a cheerfulness that was almost disconcerting. "It's time you went home and had those headaches seen to by a specialist," was her comment on the situation. The homeward journey of the Brimley Bomefields was a veritable retreat from Moscow, and what made it the more bitter was the fact that the Moscow in this case was not overwhelmed with fire and ashes, but merely extravagantly over-illuminated. From mutual friends and acquaintances, they sometimes get glimpses of their prodigal relative, who has settled down into a confirmed gambling maniac, living on such salvage of income as obliging moneylenders have left at her disposal. "So you need not be surprised," concluded Clovis, "if they do wear a depressed look in public." "Which is Veronique?" asked the Baroness. "The most depressed-looking of the three," said Clovis. The Peace Offering. "I want you to help me in getting up a dramatic entertainment of some sort," said the Baroness to Clovis. "You see, there's been an election petition down here, and a member unseated, and no end of bitterness and ill-feeling, and the county is socially divided against itself. I thought a play of some kind would be an excellent opportunity for bringing people together again, and giving them something to think of, besides tiresome political squabbles." The Baroness was evidently ambitious of reproducing beneath her own roof the pacifying effects traditionally ascribed to the celebrated Reel of Tulloch Gorm. "We might do something on the lines of Greek tragedy," said Clovis, after due reflection. "The Return of Agamemnon, for instance." The Baroness frowned. "It sounds rather reminiscent of an election result, doesn't it?" "It wasn't that sort of return," explained Clovis. "It was a homecoming." "I thought you said it was a tragedy." "Well, it was. He was killed in his bathroom, you know." "Oh, now I know the story, of course. Do you want me to take the part of Charlotte Corday?" "That's a different story, and a different century," said Clovis. "The dramatic unities forbid one to lay a scene in more than one century at a time. The killing, in this case, has to be done by Clytemnestra." "Oh, rather a pretty name. I'll do that part. I suppose you want to be whatever his name is?" "Dear no. Agamemnon was the father of grown-up children, and probably wore a beard and looked prematurely aged. I shall be his charioteer, or bath attendant, or something decorative of that kind. We must do everything in the Semioran manner, you know." "I don't know," said the Baroness. "At least, I should know better if you would explain exactly what you mean by the Semioran manner." Clovis obliged. "Weird music, and exotic skippings and flying leaps, and lots of drapery and undrapery, particularly undrapery. I think I told you the county are coming. The county won't stand anything very Greek." "Well, you can get over any objection by calling it hygiene or limb culture or something of that sort. After all, everyone exposes their insides to the public gaze and sympathy nowadays, so why not one's outside?" "My dear boy, I can ask the county to a Greek play or to a costume play, but to a Greek costume play, never. It doesn't do to let the dramatic instinct carry one too far. One must consider one's environment. When one lives among greyhounds, one should avoid giving lifelike imitations of a rabbit, unless one wants one's head snapped off. Remember, I've got this place on a 7 years' lease. And then," continued the Baroness, "as to skippings and flying leaps, I must ask Emily Dushford to take a part. She's a dear, good thing, and will do anything she's told, or try to. But can you imagine her doing a flying leap under any circumstances? She can be Cassandra, and she need only take flying leaps into the future, in a metaphorical sense." "Cassandra. Rather a pretty name. What kind of character is she?" "She was a sort of advance agent for calamities. To know her was to know the worst. Fortunately for the gaiety of the age she lived in, no one took her very seriously. Still, it must have been fairly galling to have her turning up after every catastrophe with a conscious air of Perhaps another time you'll believe what I say. I should have wanted to kill her. As Clytemnestra, I believe you gratify that very natural wish. But then it has a happy ending, in spite of its being a tragedy. Well, hardly, said Clovis. You see, the satisfaction of putting a violent end to Cassandra must have been considerably damped by the fact that she had foretold what was going to happen to her. She probably dies with an intensely irritating what-did-I-tell-you smile on her lips. By the way, of course all the killing will be done in the Semioran manner. Please explain again, said the Baroness, taking out a notebook and pencil. Little and often, you know, instead of one sweeping blow. You see, you are at your own home, so there's no need to hurry over the murdering, as though it were some disagreeable but necessary duty. And what sort of end do I have? I mean, what curtain do I get? I suppose you rush into your lover's arms. That is where one of the flying leaps will come in. The getting up and rehearsing of the play seemed likely to cause, in a restricted area, nearly as much heart-burning and ill-feeling as the election petition. Clovis, as adapter and stage manager, insisted, as far as he was able, on the charioteer being quite the most prominent character in the play, and his panther-skin tunic caused almost as much trouble and discussion as Clytemnestra's spasmodic succession of lovers, who broke down on probation with alarming uniformity. When the cast was at length fixed beyond hope of reprieve, matters went scarcely more smoothly. Clovis and the Baroness rather overdid the Semioran manner, while the rest of the company could hardly be said to attempt it at all. As for Cassandra, who was expected to improvise her own prophecies, she appeared to be as incapable of taking flying leaps into futurity as of executing more than a severely plantigrade walk across the stage. "Woe, Trojans! Woe to Troy!" was the most inspired remark she could produce, after several hours of conscientious study of all the available authorities. "It's no earthly use foretelling the fall of Troy," expostulated Clovis, "because Troy has fallen before the action of the play begins. And you mustn't say too much about your own impending doom either, because that will give things away too much to the audience." After several minutes of painful brain-searching, Cassandra smiled reassuringly. "I know. I'll predict a long and happy reign for George V." "My dear girl," protested Clovis, "have you reflected that Cassandra specialized in foretelling calamities?" There was another prolonged pause, and another triumphant issue. "I know. I'll foretell a most disastrous season for the foxhounds." "On no account," entreated Clovis. "Do remember that all Cassandra's predictions came true. The MFH and the Hunt Secretary are both awfully superstitious, and they are both going to be present." Cassandra retreated hastily to her bedroom to bathe her eyes before appearing at tea. The Baroness and Clovis were by this time scarcely on speaking terms. Each sincerely wished their respective role to be the pivot round which the entire production should revolve, and each lost no opportunity for furthering the cause they had at heart. As fast as Clovis introduced some effective bit of business for the charioteer, and he introduced a great many, the Baroness would remorselessly cut it out, or more often dovetail it into her own part, while Clovis retaliated in a similar fashion whenever possible. The climax came when Clytemnestra annexed some highly complimentary lines, which were to have been addressed to the charioteer by a bevy of admiring Greek damsels, and put them into the mouth of her lover. Clovis stood by in apparent unconcern, while the words, "Oh, lovely stripling, radiant as the dawn," were transposed into, "Oh, Clytemnestra, radiant as the dawn." But there was a dangerous glitter in his eye that might have given the Baroness warning. He had composed the verse himself, inspired and thoroughly carried away by his subject. He suffered, therefore, a double pang in beholding his tribute deflected from its destined object, and his words mutilated and twisted into what became an extravagant panegyric on the Baroness's personal charms. It was from this moment that he became gentle and assiduous in his private coaching of Cassandra. The county, forgetting its dissensions, mustered in full strength to witness the much-talked-of production. The protective providence that looks after little children and amateur theatricals made good its traditional promise that everything should be right on the night. The Baroness and Clovis seemed to have sunk their mutual differences, and between them dominated the scene, to the partial eclipse of all the other characters, who, for the most part, seemed well content to remain in the shadow. Even Agamemnon, with 10 years of strenuous life around Troy standing to his credit, appeared to be an unobtrusive personality compared with his flamboyant charioteer. But the moment came for Cassandra, who had been excused from any very definite outpourings during rehearsals, to support her role by delivering herself of a few well-chosen anticipations of pending misfortune. The musicians obliged with appropriately lugubrious wailings and thumpings, and the Baroness seized the opportunity to make a dash to the dressing-room to effect certain repairs in her make-up. Cassandra, nervous but resolute, came down to the footlights, and, like one repeating a carefully learned lesson, flung her remarks straight at the audience. "I see woe for this fair country if the brood of corrupt, self-seeking, unscrupulous, unprincipled politicians—" Here she named one of the two rival parties in the state, "continue to infest and poison our local councils and undermine our parliamentary representation, if they continue to snatch votes by nefarious and discreditable means." A humming, as of a great hive of bewildered and affronted bees, drowned her further remarks, and wore down the droning of the musicians. The Baroness, who should have been greeted on her return to the stage with the pleasing invocation, "O Clytemnestra, radiant as the dawn," heard instead the imperious voice of Lady Thistledale ordering her carriage, and something like a storm of open discord going on at the back of the room. The social divisions in the county healed themselves after their own fashion. Both parties found common ground in condemning the Baroness's outrageously bad taste and tactlessness. She has been fortunate in subletting for the greater part of her 7 years' lease. Tobermory. It was a chill, rain-washed afternoon of a late August day, that indefinite season when partridges are still in security or cold storage, and there is nothing to hunt, unless one is bounded on the north by the Bristol Channel, in which case one may lawfully gallop after fat red stags. Lady Blemley's house-party was not bounded on the north by the Bristol Channel. Hence there was a full gathering of her guests round the tea-table on this particular afternoon, and in spite of the blankness of the season and the triteness of the occasion, there was no trace in the company of that fatigued restlessness which means a dread of the pianola and a subdued hankering for auction bridge. The undisguised, open-mouthed attention of the entire party was fixed on the homely, negative personality of Mr. Cornelius Appin. Of all her guests, he was the one who had come to Lady Blemley with the vaguest reputation. Someone had said he was clever, and he had got his invitation in the moderate expectation, on the part of his hostess, that some portion at least of his cleverness would be contributed to the general entertainment. Until tea-time that day, she had been unable to discover in what direction, if any, his cleverness lay. He was neither a wit nor a croquet champion, a hypnotic force nor a begetter of amateur theatricals. Neither did his exterior suggest the sort of man in whom women are willing to pardon a generous measure of mental deficiency. He had subsided into mere Mr. Appin, and the Cornelius seemed a piece of transparent baptismal bluff. And now he was claiming to have launched on the world a discovery beside which the invention of gunpowder, of the printing press, and of steam locomotion were inconsiderable trifles. Science had made bewildering strides in many directions during recent decades, but this thing seemed to belong to the domain of miracle rather than to scientific achievement. "And do you really ask us to believe," Sir Wilfrid was saying, "that you have discovered a means for instructing animals in the art of human speech, and that dear old Tobermory has proved your first successful pupil?" "It is a problem at which I have worked for the last 17 years, said Mr. Appin, "but only during the last 8 or 9 months have I been rewarded with glimmerings of success. Of course, I have experimented with thousands of animals, but latterly only with cats, those wonderful creatures which have assimilated themselves so marvellously with our civilization, while retaining all their highly developed feral instincts. Here and there among cats one comes across an outstanding superior intellect, just as one does among the ruck of human beings, and when I made the acquaintance of Tobermory a week ago, I saw at once that I was in contact with a beyond cat of extraordinary intelligence. I had gone far along the road to success in recent experiments. With Tobermory, as you call him, I have reached the goal." Mr. Appin concluded his remarkable statement in a voice which he strove to divest of a triumphant inflection. No one said "rats," though Clovis's lips moved in a monosyllabic contortion which probably invoked those rodents of disbelief. "And do you mean to say," asked Miss Resker, after a slight pause, "that you have taught Tobermory to say and understand easy sentences of one syllable?" "My dear Miss Resker," said the wonder-worker patiently, "one teaches little children and savages and backward adults in that piecemeal fashion. When one has once solved the problem of making a beginning with an animal of highly developed intelligence, one has no need for those halting methods. Tobermory can speak our language with perfect correctness." This time Clovis very distinctly said, "Beyond rats." Sir Wilfrid was more polite, but equally sceptical. "Hadn't we better have the cat in and judge for ourselves?" suggested Lady Blemley. Sir Wilfrid went in search of the animal, and the company settled themselves down to the languid expectation of witnessing some more or less adroit drawing-room ventriloquism. In a minute Sir Wilfrid was back in the room, his face white beneath its tan, and his eyes dilated with excitement. "By gad, it's true!" His agitation was unmistakably genuine, and his hearers started forward in a thrill of awakened interest. Collapsing into an armchair, he continued breathlessly, "I found him dozing in the smoking-room, and called out to him to come for his tea. He blinked at me in his usual way, and I said, 'Come on, Toby, don't keep us waiting.' And, by gad, he drawled out in a most horribly natural voice that he'd come when he dashed well pleased. I nearly jumped out of my skin." Appin had preached to absolutely incredulous hearers. Sir Wilfrid's statement carried instant conviction. A Babel-like chorus of startled exclamation arose, amid which the scientist sat mutely enjoying the first fruit of his stupendous discovery. In the midst of the clamour, Tobermory entered the room, and made his way with velvet tread and studied unconcern across to the group seated round the tea-table. A sudden hush of awkwardness and constraint fell on the company. Somehow there seemed an element of embarrassment in addressing on equal terms a domestic cat of acknowledged mental ability. "Will you have some milk, Tobermory?" asked Lady Blemley in a rather strained voice. "I don't mind if I do," was the response, couched in a tone of even indifference. A shiver of suppressed excitement went through the listeners, and Lady Blemley might be excused for pouring out the saucerful of milk rather unsteadily. "I'm afraid I've spilt a good deal of it," she said, apologetically. "After all, it's not my Axminster," was Tobermory's rejoinder. Another silence fell on the group, and then Miss Resker, in her best district visitor manner, asked if the human language had been difficult to learn. Tobermory looked squarely at her for a moment, and then fixed his gaze serenely on the middle distance. It was obvious that boring questions lay outside his scheme of life. "What do you think of human intelligence?" asked Mavis Pellington, lamely. "Of whose intelligence in particular?" asked Tobermory, coldly. "Oh, well, mine, for instance," said Mavis, with a feeble laugh. "You put me in an embarrassing position," said Tobermory, whose tone and attitude certainly did not suggest a shred of embarrassment. "When your inclusion in this house-party was suggested, Sir Wilfrid protested that you were the most brainless woman of his acquaintance, and that there was a wide distinction between hospitality and the care of the feeble-minded. Lady Blemley replied that your lack of brain power was the precise quality which had earned you your invitation, as you were the only person she could think of who might be idiotic enough to buy their old car. You know, the one they call the envy of Sisyphus, because it goes quite nicely uphill if you push it." Lady Blemley's protestations would have had greater effect if she had not casually suggested to Mavis only that morning that the car in question would be just the thing for her down at her Devonshire home. Major Barfield plunged in heavily to effect a diversion. "How about your carryings-on with the tortoise-shell puss up at the stables, eh?" The moment he had said it, everyone realized the blunder. "One does not usually discuss these matters in public," said Tobermory, frigidly. "From a slight observation of your ways since you've been in this house, I should imagine you'd find it inconvenient if I were to shift the conversation onto your own little affairs." The panic which ensued was not confined to the Major. "Would you like to go and see if cook has got your dinner ready?" suggested Lady Blemley, hurriedly, affecting to ignore the fact that it wanted at least 2 hours to Tobermory's dinner-time. "Thanks," said Tobermory. "Not quite so soon after my tea. I don't want to die of indigestion." "Cats have 9 lives, you know," said Sir Wilfrid, heartily. "Possibly," answered Tobermory, "but only 1 liver." "Adelaide," said Mrs. Cornet, "do you mean to encourage that cat to go out and gossip about us in the servants' hall?" The panic had indeed become general. A narrow ornamental balustrade ran in front of most of the bedroom windows at the Towers, and it was recalled with dismay that this had formed a favourite promenade for Tobermory at all hours, whence he could watch the pigeons, and heaven knew what else besides. If he intended to become reminiscent in his present outspoken strain, the effect would be something more than disconcerting. Mrs. Cornet, who spent much time at her toilet-table, and whose complexion was reputed to be of a nomadic, though punctual disposition, looked as ill at ease as the Major. Miss Scrowan, who wrote fiercely sensuous poetry and led a blameless life, merely displayed irritation. If you are methodical and virtuous in private, you don't necessarily want everyone to know it. Bertie Van Tarn, who was so depraved at 17 that he had long ago given up trying to be any worse, turned a dull shade of gardenia white. But he did not commit the error of dashing out of the room like Odo Finsbury, a young gentleman who was understood to be reading for the church, and who was possibly disturbed at the thought of scandals he might hear concerning other people. Clovis had the presence of mind to maintain a composed exterior. Privately, he was calculating how long it would take to procure a box of fancy mice through the agency of the Exchange and Mart as a species of hush money. Even in a delicate situation like the present, Agnes Resker could not endure to remain too long in the background. "Why did I ever come down here?" she asked dramatically. Tobermory immediately accepted the opening. "Judging by what you said to Mrs. Cornet on the croquet lawn yesterday, you were out for food. You described the Blemleys as the dullest people to stay with that you knew, but said they were clever enough to employ a first-rate cook. Otherwise they'd find it difficult to get anyone to come down a second time." "There's not a word of truth in it. I appeal to Mrs. Cornet," exclaimed the discomfited Agnes. "Mrs. Cornet repeated your remark afterwards to Bertie Van Tarn," continued Tobermory, "and said, 'That woman is a regular hunger marcher. She'd go anywhere for 4 square meals a day.' And Bertie Van Tarn said—" At this point the chronicle mercifully ceased. Tobermory had caught a glimpse of the big yellow Tom from the rectory, working his way through the shrubbery towards the stable wing. In a flash he had vanished through the open French window. With the disappearance of his too brilliant pupil, Cornelius Appin found himself beset by a hurricane of bitter upbraiding, anxious inquiry, and frightened entreaty. The responsibility for the situation lay with him, and he must prevent matters from becoming worse. Could Tobermory impart his dangerous gift to other cats? Was the first question he had to answer. It was possible, he replied, that he might have initiated his intimate friend, the stable puss, into his new accomplishment, but it was unlikely that his teaching could have taken a wider range as yet. "Then," said Mrs. Cornet, "Tobermory may be a valuable cat and a great pet, but I'm sure you'll agree, Adelaide, that both he and the stable cat must be done away with without delay." "You don't suppose I've enjoyed the last quarter of an hour, do you?" said Lady Blemley bitterly. "My husband and I are very fond of Tobermory. At least we were, before this horrible accomplishment was infused into him. But now, of course, the only thing is to have him destroyed as soon as possible." "We can put some strychnine in the scraps he always gets at dinner-time," said Sir Wilfrid, "and I will go down and drown the stable cat myself. The coachman will be very sore at losing his pet, but I'll say a very catching form of mange has broken out in both cats, and we're afraid of it spreading to the kennels." "But my great discovery," expostulated Mr. Appin. "After all my years of research and experiment—" "You can go and experiment on the shorthorns at the farm, who are under proper control," said Mrs. Cornet, "or the elephants at the zoological gardens. They're said to be highly intelligent, and they have this recommendation, that they don't come creeping about our bedrooms and under chairs and so forth." An archangel ecstatically proclaiming the millennium, and then finding that it clashed unpardonably with Henley and would have to be indefinitely postponed, could hardly have felt more crestfallen than Cornelius Appin at the reception of his wonderful achievement. Public opinion, however, was against him. In fact, had the general voice been consulted on the subject, it is probable that a strong minority vote would have been in favour of including him in the strychnine diet. Defective train arrangements and a nervous desire to see matters brought to a finish prevented an immediate dispersal of the party, but dinner that evening was not a social success. Sir Wilfrid had had rather a trying time with the stable cat, and subsequently with the coachman, Agnes Resker ostentatiously limited her repast to a morsel of dry toast, which she bit as though it were a personal enemy, while Mavis Pellington maintained a vindictive silence throughout the meal. Lady Blemley kept up a flow of what she hoped was conversation, but her attention was fixed on the doorway. A plateful of carefully dosed fish scraps was in readiness on the sideboard, but sweets and savoury and dessert went their way, and no Tobermory appeared, either in the dining-room or kitchen. The sepulchral dinner was cheerful compared with the subsequent vigil in the smoking-room. Eating and drinking had at least supplied a distraction and cloak to the prevailing embarrassment. Bridge was out of the question in the general tension of nerves and tempers, and after Odo Finsbury had given a lugubrious rendering of Melisande in the Wood to a frigid audience, music was tacitly avoided. At 11, the servants went to bed, announcing that the small window in the pantry had been left open as usual for Tobermory's private use. The guests read steadily through the current batch of magazines, and fell back gradually on the Badminton Library and bound volumes of Punch. Lady Blemley made periodic visits to the pantry, returning each time with an expression of listless depression, which forestalled questioning. At 2 o'clock, Clovis broke the dominating silence. "He won't turn up tonight. He's probably in the local newspaper office at the present moment, dictating the first instalment of his reminiscences. Lady What's-her-name's book won't be in it. It will be the event of the day." Having made this contribution to the general cheerfulness, Clovis went to bed. At long intervals, the various members of the house party followed his example. The servants taking round the early tea made a uniform announcement in reply to a uniform question. Tobermory had not returned. Breakfast was, if anything, a more unpleasant function than dinner had been, but before its conclusion the situation was relieved. Tobermory's corpse was brought in from the shrubbery, where a gardener had just discovered it. From the bites on his throat and the yellow fur which coated his claws, it was evident that he had fallen in unequal combat with the big Tom from the rectory. By midday most of the guests had quitted the Towers, and after lunch Lady Blemley had sufficiently recovered her spirits to write an extremely nasty letter to the rectory about the loss of her valuable pet. Tobermory had been Appin's one successful pupil, and he was destined to have no successor. A few weeks later, an elephant in the Dresden Zoological Garden, which had shown no previous signs of irritability, broke loose and killed an Englishman who had apparently been teasing it. The victim's name was variously reported in the papers as Oppin and Eppelin, but his front name was faithfully rendered Cornelius. "If he was trying German irregular verbs on the poor beast," said Clovis, "he deserved all he got." You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you enjoy these stories and would like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, as well as purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2025. Thank you for listening.